Hardcore Finance Show listeners. This is Alex Chiswick coming to you, and we have a very special guest today. We have Lee Bratcher from the Texas Blockchain Council. Lee's actually the founder and president of the Texas Blockchain Council, which is working to push crypto-friendly, Bitcoin-friendly regulations, obviously in Texas and across the U.S. So, Lee, welcome to the show. Really happy to have you, and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me. Excited to be on the show. So as you said, I'm the president of the Texas Blockchain Council. I've got a unique background that listeners may not expect that has landed me here. I originally was in law enforcement in the military. I was an officer in the United States Army and still am in the reserves. And it's been a few years also in law enforcement as a police officer. And then from there, I jumped into academia. So the last 5 years, I've been teaching political science, researching land registries, property rights, and blockchain specifically for property transfer and transparency. And so this technology, I came at this technology from a unique perspective, which is different than most people in the space. And they kind of came at it from a finance perspective or a crypto perspective. But once I was in the space studying, real estate and property transfer on blockchain, I really fell down the rabbit hole on crypto and Bitcoin as well, and took the red pill, as they say. And then I started getting involved in the community in Dallas and in the Texas area, Austin as well. And there was a need for an organization that could be sort of an industry association to bring public policy and political communications and to try to set the narrative for Texas. And I took that head on, and we're growing like crazy and have some great recent successes to talk about.
Yeah, so I'd love to touch upon the Texas Blockchain Council, but let's park that for a second. I want to explore your background because, like you said, everyone does jump into this from a finance perspective. And you mentioned something. You mentioned three unique things to me. The whole protecting or law enforcement, right? So law enforcement and army, that's one. Two, how you're an academic, you also teach in academia, so you understand, I think, the political aspects of it. So we should talk about regulation. But I want to jump onto this third one. You mentioned property rights. And many people don't think about property rights in Bitcoin. And frankly, most of our listeners are in the U.S. I think we're very fortunate in the U.S. to have very solid property rights. And actually, property rights are a foundation and a bedrock for a solid democracy and a solid capitalist system. Because, well, you can keep your property, and the government and other people shouldn't take it away from you, bar some caveats and so on. We don't need to go into those caveats, but people have entitlement to their property. But talk a little bit about that. How did that speak to you when you thought about Bitcoin? Because you mentioned that right off the bat. Very few people just jump to that.
Yeah, there's a book called The Mystery of Capital by Hernando de Soto, who's a famous Peruvian economist. And he talks a lot about property rights and how in the West, and especially in the US, it's already hard-coded into our DNA. And we honestly, no one has the institutional memory to realize where we got or how we got to where we are today with such a robust system of property rights. And it's over the course of centuries that it's developed, and we can't replicate that. It's very difficult to just plug and play in a developing country because there's just this hard-coded institutional framework that's developed over centuries that does not exist in most developing countries. And so when it comes to technology like blockchain and proof of work and kind of this consensus mechanisms that secure this value transfer technology, you really see a lot of parallels to economics, to the Austrian school, to Hernando de Soto and his thoughts on capital and property rights. And so I've just been enamored with the intersection of the technology and some economic thinking that has been with us for the Austrian school for a couple hundred years. And it provides a really great framework from which to jump off into what is actually possible with uncensorable money and uncensorable value transfer, and the ability to provide financial services to people across the world who were previously unbanked. It not only from an academic perspective, but from a practical perspective, that's just an incredible humanitarian opportunity that I think we'd be remiss to not dive into that as a crypto community and as a blockchain community.
Well, tell me a little bit about, or tell listeners a little bit about, how does blockchain and Bitcoin solve property rights? What are they, and how does it solve it?
Yeah, property rights can be very broad, and I'll use the example of real property in real estate to illustrate it for the listeners, because that's kind of more tangible in our minds. Currently, the United States has this property transfer record system that's based on counties. Each county in Texas or in the country, records titles and deeds in a recorder's office, and that works reasonably well for us. We don't really have an issue with property rights. We have great title insurance programs, but it actually could work even better with blockchain. But before I even talk about how it could work better in the US, let me talk about how it could work better in the developing world, where those institutions are not as robust. And you have transparency issues and bribery, where people go into the registry and just change the name of ownership on a deed or property record for a lakefront property in XYZ country. It just provides so much more uncertainty, and you have less financial incentive to actually invest in that property, make it more productive for the flourishing of the property, the environment, the community, everybody who kind of that ecosystem, if you will. So blockchain technology can solve a couple different things. It can solve the transparency issue, which is huge with property rights, right? You want to link in with the court system and have a rule of law be primary. That's that first function, and then the second function is transparency. So you increase your rule of law and the citizens' confidence in the governance and the rule of law of the country by providing transparency. And we know that blockchain technology allows for greater transparency than any other system that we've ever seen. It's like the next iteration of double entry accounting, right? We see that come on in the Middle Ages. In fact, actually the Renaissance with Luca Pacioli. He invents double entry accounting in the 15th century, and it's the first time that this value transfer is possible between parties that don't know each other. If you've read Tapscott's Blockchain Revolution, I think he talks about it in there. I've read a couple of books on blockchain, and one of the ones is probably Tapscott's book that talks about Luca Pacioli. And so now blockchain is this next iteration on double entry accounting. It's a ledger that allows for transparency and for value transfer. And the most exciting part for those in the United States is going to be the decreased transaction costs. People abroad in developing countries are going to be really excited about the transparency and lowering of corruption. But here we have a decently, our systems are decently orchestrated and have incredible histories of being fair and transparent, but we have decently high transaction costs too. And that's where blockchain can really help in property transfer and property rights. When you're transferring your rights to a piece of property, real or otherwise, intellectual property or whatever, you want to be able to transfer that with the least amount of friction possible. So if you expand it, imagine tokenizing some sort of intellectual property and the liquidity that could be provided there. Just so much easier, bringing down the transaction costs. And so that's just a few thoughts that come to mind initially when you ask that.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of things that are very interesting. Another great book is actually Nick Batia's Layered Money, when he talks exactly about this. And in some ways, cryptocurrency, this whole space has evolved, but cryptocurrency in some ways is a misnomer to what at least Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is digital property, digital gold, in the future. I do believe digital real estate, the real estate of the Web3 of the new internet, and and it's very important to be able to hold on to property and pass it along without confiscation. So I won't mention which country, but my wife's family was in a Latin American country. She's from there, wasn't born here. Their land and property was confiscated, just taken away. And so we don't face this in the U.S. But a lot of folks in the world, and maybe in the U.S. and some Western countries, we don't face this. But look at China, look at Russia, look at Africa, look at Latin America. The majority of the world, even India, has property rights issues where the institutions aren't as robust. And so when people, I want to touch upon some illicit activity and Ponzi scheme-ish of Bitcoin, and people say, Bitcoin uses too much energy, it's used for illicit activities. It's a very privileged thing to say, right? It's a very privileged perspective to say, well, it's just a bunch of meme traders, millennials that are going out and pumping on dumping. Yeah, there is speculation in these currencies. But while for the US, it might be speculation on the value, for real hardcore crypto enthusiasts, hardcore Bitcoiners in this case, they believe in property rights. That's the ultimate. When people say, what's the fundamental value of Bitcoin? Property rights, right? And this is the only inflation hedge that we have that's easy to transport. You're not going to carry bags of gold around, right? Which is, you could, but then somebody can come after you literally and kidnap you and shoot you. You can carry Bitcoin in your head. The passwords will be your Bitcoin in your head ultimately, or on a thumb drive or whatever. And you can cross borders and move with your wealth. And it's a very privileged thing in the US to say, well, it's again speculative, but for the rest of the world, this is a real life, other than health and just living in peace, being able to hold on to wealth is at the bottom, at a base case of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so for them, when you say, well, what pain point does Bitcoin solve? The ultimate pain point, literally the ultimate pain point of being able to live, a healthy, safe, and peaceful, and prosperous life. And so tell me a little bit about this, right? Let's, the other knock on Bitcoin and cryptos is, it uses too much energy, and it's used for illicit activities. Elizabeth Warren came out and said that, it's used for illicit activities. A lot of other politicians are now coming out against Bitcoin. Donald Trump also said it's a fraud. So it's both from the left and the right that people are coming out against this. You were and are, in the military, in law enforcement. So, why are you defending something that's clearly used for evil?
Great question. And before I jump into that, I did want to say Nick Bottia's book, Layered Money, great read. He's actually going to be a speaker at our October conference. We can talk about that more in a minute. But Nick Bottia and Nick Carter are both going to be there. But in regards to, let's tackle the illicit transactions first. First of all, yes, in the past, the Bitcoin network was the wild, wild west. And we don't shy away from that, just like the internet was the wild, wild west when it was first developed. But we see now that the percentage of transactions used in illicit activity are actually lower than the percentage of transactions in the traditional banking system in 2021. And now that's not coming from me. That's the former CIA director actually stating that. So you can look that article up on Forbes. And another thing, when I'm testifying in front of the Texas legislature, the Financial Services Committee, and they're asking me these questions, I'll tell them, hey, how many of you have a $20 bill in your pocket? And several of them will raise their hand, and I'll tell them there's a greater likelihood that $20 bill has been laundered than any digital currency in a digital wallet, especially Bitcoin. I mean, and the DOJ and the FBI have become extremely talented, or they've actually onboarded some great talent with blockchain analytics firms that are able to track down cyber criminals. And so, even the pipeline hack from last month, they were able to recoup some of that money, mostly because the criminals disposed of it in a hot wallet, I think, and it was probably poor, criminal activity on their part. But
Or professional criminal professionalism. Or criminal.
exactly, exactly. And the they were able to get a warrant for that server. But even so, we're going to see criminal activity revert back to cash. That's the ultimate bearer asset. And these criminals are going to get wise really quick to realize, okay, there's a lot more transparency on the Bitcoin network now than there was 10 years ago, and I need to go back to using cash to create this anonymity. And not to say that there's not anonymity on Bitcoin. There's anonymity, but there's those actors that are using it for commerce and for, like you said, wealth transfer, moving money across borders. Those actions, are what it was designed for. It wasn't designed for illicit activity. So we want to aggressively pursue those using it for illicit activity, and we want to aggressively defend those using it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I want to bring up a couple of things, and I definitely want to talk about the conference because that sounds exciting, and I'd love to hear more. I'm also working with various states. I think this is how you and I met. And when I speak to representatives of the states, in fact, the banking commissioners and folks that are responsible for the banking system are on board with crypto and Bitcoin. They are responsible for keeping the system safe, right? I don't think any major player in the space, especially institutions, want to avoid AML, KYC, and want to avoid sensible regulation. And in fact, I think a lot of folks, such as myself, such as yourself, such as people in the different states, and I want to hear about the blockchain council, who you have on board there, and how people can get involved. But representatives from the states, we're trying to put sensible regulation in a space that's right. It's not unregulated. It's definitely regulated, but create sensible guardrails and a path for the industry to then take off, to innovate and go forward. And I think many people miss that part. There's room for sensible regulation. Again, MicroStrategy or Square or Tesla or or BNY Mellon or any of the players that have gotten in or are thinking of getting in the future. None of them are saying, hey, I want to avoid AML, KYC or other aspects. Of course not. And none of us want to fund terrorism. But just like, there is illicit activity happening on the internet. Does that mean the internet's bad? No, of course not. There's always going to be, I think, for every technology, there's the criminal and there's the people are catching criminals, and you try to outsmart and outdo each other. That's just the way the world works. I actually heard this recently. I had no idea. Lumber is used for a lot of money laundering. Lumber, because you can manipulate prices of various lumber contracts and so on. So what, should we stop, using wood? It's that argument to me, when people bring it up, is so short-sighted and so myopic in their thinking that it shows a lack of fundamental understanding of how innovation develops, how innovative changes proceed. But tell me a little bit more. The other knock is energy. That uses a lot of electricity. And you have your grid, and I'm going to knock on Texas a little bit. You have your ERCOT grid going up and down, and people are now saying, "Oh, look, all these miners are moving from China into ERCOT, overloading a already loaded grid. Oh my God, what's going to happen?" Are you nervous about that?
No, we're not. In fact, I was just down at a major industrial mining facility last week with Representative Tan Parker, one of the legislators from Texas, and there's a lot of misunderstandings around the energy consumption on the global scale, and then especially for Texas too, and in the U.S. The Bitcoin miners actually are incentivized to flock towards the lowest cost energy possible, and they're also incentivized to locate themselves in such a way where they will find 10, 20, 100 megawatts worth of power very cheaply, and those geographic locations and those interconnectors are either, if they're connected to the grid, they're going to be using energy in a geography that energy wasn't going to be able to get to. That was going to be wasted energy anyways. So maybe it was energy that was coming off of wind turbines. It was a really windy day, but there weren't enough transmission lines to get that energy to the Dallas, Houston, Austin, the population draw, the energy draws of the state. Well, you can actually use data centers, crypto data centers, to soak up some of that energy and use it. So it's base demand, it's base supply of energy that's being used by miners that otherwise oftentimes would be wasted. And not only that, a lot of this energy that's being used for mining is renewable. They're using, in Appalachia, they're using hydro. In upstate New York, they're using hydro as long as the legislators in New York allow it. I know there's some legislation being considered that would disallow that, which would be crazy because that's 100% renewables. And then in Texas, we've got an incredible supply of wind, solar, and natural gas. And there's a lot of miners that are mining off of flared natural gas. Again, otherwise wasted energy that would be flared off into the atmosphere, that they're actually capturing that energy, putting it into a natural gas generator, creating electricity, and mining Bitcoin from it.
Yeah, Lee, just so 1 second for our listeners, so who don't know energy and electricity, flaring, you literally take excess energy, like you talked about natural gas in this case. You sometimes have methane gas, or even off of oil fields. And methane, for example, I used to work in the industry before my business school days. Methane is 23 times worse than CO2 for the environment. So what people do is you burn methane. You literally create a fire flame. And as the gas escapes, like you would in any kind of gas grill, it just burns. So it converts methane or natural gas into carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is, again, it's bad, but it's 23 times less bad than the methane, and just goes off into the air. So what miners are doing is they're capping it. They're putting it's called a genset, a generation set, essentially on top of that flame. So instead of that gas going up into the air, it just goes up and spins a turbine and makes Bitcoin. So you're actually just taking something that would have already been gone and wasted and converting that into Bitcoin. So when people attack these uses of energy, they're, again, fundamentally completely misunderstanding what's actually happening on the ground and just spreading talking points without getting even a level deep into the nuance. So sorry, I wanted to touch upon that because the flaring, many people don't understand what flaring actually is. So think about, again, it's like grilling, except that you're just covering the grill and converting it into Bitcoin, but you're going to be grilling no matter what. It's either goes in the air or converts into Bitcoin, but it's going out there, right? That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, and two other major points that I want to get across. The miners in Texas are very community oriented. These industrial scale mines are thinking about the communities that they're located in, often rural communities, which is bringing jobs to rural communities. And not only that, they're turning off during peak demand. We have demand response pricing in the ERCOT grid. We also have a deregulated energy grid so that the price floats with demand. And so when there's a peak in demand, like in extremely cold times or extremely hot times, the miners will turn off, and they're doing that because they want to help push that power back into the grid to the communities that need it. But they're also doing it because they have a financial incentive to do so, because they're able to actually make more money on pushing power back into the grid than they would be mining Bitcoin. So a lot of people have asked me, like, well, why would they do that? Why would they be so kind-hearted, if you will? Well, they're doing it because they have an economic incentive to do so. They're able to provide that power back into the grid, and ERCOT's able to compensate them for that. So they're an intermittent user. And if you want to learn more about intermittent users, there's a great paper by Square that actually talks about, and Nick Carter actually has a good paper in the Harvard Business Review that talks about how these intermittent users, like mining data centers, crypto mining data centers, are actually incentivizing greater renewables production because they're creating a larger baseload demand that's intermittent. And one of the biggest knocks on renewables is wind and solar, especially, is that it's intermittent. And when you combine an intermittent user like Bitcoin miners with wind and solar, you have a really powerful force for green energy incentives. And keep in mind, not even subsidized incentives. These are naturally occurring market incentives that are inducing greater production of wind and solar because of intermittent data centers.
So tell me a little bit more. I know you have a hard stop and we'll have to wrap in a few minutes here. But I definitely want to hear a little bit more about the council. Who are members? What are you guys doing? And tell me about this October conference and how people can get involved.
Yeah. So the Texas Blockchain Council is a 501c6 nonprofit industry association, kind of like a chamber of commerce. We do business development for our member companies. We're just breached 50 member companies. Member companies range from private equity firms, law firms, to platform companies, cryptocurrency companies, mining companies, just really all across the map, companies that touch blockchain in some way. And we do the public policy side of our operation is kind of in full force right now too. We just finished the legislative session in Texas. We helped to research 4 pieces of legislation, worked closely with some legislative partners, Senator Angela Paxton, Representative Tam Parker, and Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, who, if you follow his Twitter feed, you'll note that he's a big supporter of Bitcoin, of crypto, and of blockchain innovation in general. And so we've got 2 pieces of legislation passed, both houses, House and Senate, and they've also both been signed by the governor. One of those is a blockchain working group, 16-member group that will write the roadmap for blockchain innovation in Texas and make recommendations, provide a report making recommendations about how the state should proceed investing in this technology. And the second bill, the virtual currencies bill, makes Texas the second state in the country to put legal definitions around virtual currencies like cryptocurrencies, and define what it means to control them. So allows for multi-sig control arrangements where, for the purpose of the Uniform Commercial Code, which is business law, to be brief, you just have to own or hold 2 of the 3 cryptographic keys if you're in a 2 of 3 multi-sig situation, or whatever, 3 of 5. You just have to have the majority. And that's really important because we define that to perfect a security interest in Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency, you just merely have to control it. So that allows you to perfect your security interest. You're not having to file a financing statement or UCC1 claim like you would for other general intangibles. So all that to say, Texas becomes the second state in the country, like Wyoming, to put a legal framework around this stuff. If your listeners were attorneys, maybe they were following what I was talking about when I was talking about the Uniform Commercial Code. If not, that's okay. Just know that the Texas is going the way of Wyoming. We appreciate Wyoming's leadership. We want to partner with them. We want to bring the Texas economy alongside them. The Texas economy is the 9th largest economy in the world, bigger than Russia, bigger than Canada. So we want to support, what they're doing with state initiatives. And and then the conference in October. So October 8th, TexasBlockchainSummit.org is where you can find more information about it. That conference, it's a digital asset conference, Bitcoin centric, but also digital assets in general. We'll have speakers like Senator Cynthia Lummis, Nick Carter, Nick Bhatia, Perry M. Boring from the Digital Chamber, and also the Texas Banking Commissioner and some high-level elected officials from Texas, some of whom I can say who they are now. Some we'll have to wait and announce later. But if somebody is an industry professional, they're interested in the policy side, they're interested in a jurisdiction that's really supportive of this, we'd recommend that you check it out. We were there in Miami. We got to speak in Miami. I had the chance to speak not on the main stage, but on one of the end of fiat stage to an audience there at the Bitcoin conference in Miami. And it's going to be similar, but a little bit more geared towards lawmakers, public policy folks, industry professionals, family offices, a little less consumer focused, but we think that's okay. We think we need a conference that is really going to speak to regulators and allow regulators and industry professionals to network and to get to know each other. That's going to be really important.
Lee, so one of the things that I want to ask you about is, tell me a little bit more about what you're doing with banks, because obviously any kind of state law, and I know you're pushing for one in Texas, and Governor Abbott, signed it into law, has to do with bank regulations. You talked about Wyoming, and you talked about Texas being the biggest economy. What are banks doing?
Yeah, so many listeners will be familiar with the OCC's announcement that U.S. charter banks can custody digital assets, or federally chartered banks. They recently, they've not walked that back, but they said that that policy is under review. So that made a lot of people a little nervous. So we've been working with the Texas Banking Commissioner, the Texas Department of Banking, as have many other law firms and experts in the space. And the Texas Banking Commissioner, Mr. Charles Cooper, is actually pretty forward thinking on this. And so he and his staff made an announcement 2 weeks ago that really didn't get a lot of press, but they gave regulatory guidance to Texas charter banks that they can in fact custody digital assets, assuming that they have the proper regulatory boxes checked and the safeguards in place to secure those assets from from any kind of attack. So that's big news. It didn't get a lot of press attention, but it, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a big exchange buy up a small or mid-sized community bank in Texas just because of that regulatory certainty and the ability to be able to do that with not only crypto but also really any digital asset.
So Lee, just sorry, 1 second. Tell me a little bit more. I mean, it sounds pretty important. Why is that important?
Yeah, so there's just so much regulatory uncertainty in the U.S. We hate to see like, I mean, there's countries overseas that are providing so much more clarity that innovation and entrepreneurs and venture capital is flowing there. We're all familiar with where those places are, and so it's really important for states like Texas and also the United States in general to provide more clarity. Still want a great regulatory environment to dissuade bad actors, but we need more clarity. And just this wait and see approach that the federal agencies are taking, the regulatory agencies are taking, is just not healthy. And so for the Texas Banking Commissioner and his department to come out and provide that guidance to states, it gives a green light to entrepreneurs and reg tech, companies to provide these solutions to community banks. And these banks, they're not JP Morgan Chase. They're not going to develop their own in-house custody solutions. They're going to purchase, a custody solution from a technology provider that's been vetted and that's regulated, that's very, well aware. They sell reg tech to banks on a regular basis. They're well aware of KYC and AML. And also they're well aware of the attack vectors that people might use to get at digital assets. A company that's really forward thinking about this is Unchained Capital down in Austin. They provide some awesome custody solutions that still allows the owner of the crypto to hold their keys. So they use some unique multi-sig arrangements. And here's another piece that I think we shouldn't miss in this. I speak a lot with politicians and with legislators and policymakers. And these people are deeply patriotic. They want to make sure that the US dollar remains the dominant currency, and remains a world reserve currency. And as do I. And I think that actually we're missing something here when we're worried that Bitcoin might overtake the dollar. We actually should be talking about how Bitcoin can work in tandem with the US dollar to maintain the dollar as the world reserve currency as Bitcoin becomes kind of this supranational, value transfer system. For example, if the United States were to open up a strategic Bitcoin reserve, like we have for centuries had gold reserves, and how those gold reserves, even though currently the dollar is not backed by gold, we're all aware of that. That went away in the 70s. Before and now, our financial position as a country is what allows the U.S. to have low borrowing costs. Treasury bills, are the interest rates on them are very low, and there's a lot of confidence that the U.S. is going to be solvent for the foreseeable future. Like Germany and the U.S., the bonds are extremely cheap, and the borrowing costs are extremely cheap, and that allows for the U.S. to, that and other things, allows for the U.S. to maintain its the dollar as the world reserve currency of the world. So imagine if we had a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and 5 years from now, that reserve was what was giving uh, investors around the world confidence in the U.S. financial position, and that actually prolonged the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency for decades to come. That's something where Bitcoiners and policymakers can align on, and so I would be excited to see that. There's rumblings about, uh, you know, we are considering as an association, the Texas Blockchain Council, putting together some research and providing a thesis on this to some of the policymakers here in Texas and in DC to really flesh out this argument. And so, uh, be on the lookout for that in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, it's a there's a little bit of a game theory component to this. Again, a lot of what you said is very brilliant, and let's just unpack it. A game theory component to, if you hold, why is the U.S. dollar a reserve currency, right? Let's touch upon that in a second. But one of the reasons, like you said, it's solvent, and you almost have to have at least a piece of all the different asset pies in order to ensure to hedge against future insolvency in case some asset goes under, another asset goes up. So from a central bank perspective, right, from a U.S. geopolitical policy perspective, it's inevitable for the U.S. to buy Bitcoin. The question is when and at what price, and when they're going to worry about volatility and so on. But I'm a little surprised that now that you're kind of seeing the writing on the wall, and politicians may pretend like they're going to regulate it away in oblivion. I don't think they will, and I'll tell you why. But if they won't, you almost have to. You almost have to dip your toes into Bitcoin if you're the US. It's exactly like you said. It's not going to overtake a dollar. Bitcoin is a great store of value and a really poor currency overall. It's just not good to be used as payments. It just isn't. It's okay. The US dollar is great for payments as a legal tender. Terrible store of value. Just not. This is not Alex Lee saying this. This is data saying this. I'm looking at the valuation of a dollar. And for the U.S., there are some politicians. In this case, Elizabeth Warren came out and said, ban it. And again, you're getting this from the right and left, although for some reason more from the left recently. But it's completely missing the point that if you want to be the reserve currency of the world, you cannot impose capital controls on assets. You can't. Because once you do that, you will no longer be the reserve currency of the world in very short order. Because people won't want to hold your currency because it has on and off ramp speed bumps or blocks. Then we become China. And in fact, the reason why China is banning Bitcoin is a monumental mistake. They're not banning, they're banning mining, and then they're trying to enforce capital controls. But it's a monumental long-term mistake because the yuan will never become a reserve currency until and unless it's an open capital control removed system. Again, you just can't, it's one or the other. You want to have capital controls, or you want to be the reserve currency. You cannot be both. You cannot have both. And so from the U.S. to maintain a strategic geopolitical position, I think it has to go into it. It has no choice but to go into Bitcoin. And that's why I think all of this stuff is like short-term posturing. And ultimately, I hope the U.S. doesn't make a gigantic geopolitical mistake. But then again, this is the beauty of our government. You have a federal government, you have a state government. And the fact that what you're doing, what some of the other states are doing, are just making sure that, God forbid, the federal government doesn't make a horrendous geopolitical mistake, which looks good for the 1 or 2 short years in the short run, and it's a terrible geopolitical mistake in the long term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think we're gonna be able to articulate that thesis a little bit more effectively in the months to come because we really see what is on the horizon. We've seen what China is doing. You're exactly right. It is a huge mistake for China to do that, but we need to capitalize on that. Why would the U.S. not capitalize on one of the biggest mistakes? And China doesn't make that many mistakes. The government, for all of its flaws, they have a lot of brilliant people pulling the levers of power over there. And so we need to really capitalize on this mistake that they've made by banning mining and limiting transactions in crypto. They're very fearful of non-censorable money. and they're very fearful of the capital controls piece is also another big piece. I'm not sure which is a bigger driver. Is that fear of non-censorable money or fear of people evading capital controls, but probably both. And we'd be foolish not to. And I maybe if one of Elizabeth Warren's supporters is listening to this podcast, they can pass along to her.
Contact Lee. Contact us if you guys are.
Yeah, exactly.
Seriously.
Yeah, for real. And we work with politicians from both sides of the aisle. In fact, the bill in Texas was sponsored by Republicans and co-sponsored by Democrats. I mean, equal number. I mean, it was great cooperation between Representative Raphael Anchia and Representative Tam Parker and their colleagues from different parties. And I don't think that Elizabeth Warren really, she's brilliant, but she doesn't understand what she's denouncing. This technology could be, she's always railing against big banks. I personally don't have anything against big banks, but if I did, I would say, well, then why are you trying to destroy something that's competing with big banks to drive down the cost of banking the unbanked, or the cost, transaction costs? I don't think that Bitcoin's going to destroy the big banks in the near or medium term. And but I do think that it can compete and drive down the costs of banking the unbanked. I don't see how someone in her office hasn't communicated that to her at this point.
I think that's a problem. This is, for our listeners, especially if you're, and you're a regulatory person or you're a lawyer, really should think about attending the conference in October. Because I think, again, I agree, Elizabeth Warren objectively is a brilliant person. She's a brilliant woman. She's very, very accomplished. And I think that just someone in her staff, heard a couple of quips here and there. Many people don't understand Bitcoin and crypto. And they told her, oh, they heard it's bad for the environment, right? Oh, it's done for illicit activities. I think if Elizabeth Warren sits down for a couple hours, but really, gives it a good go, what the Bitcoin deserves because of the idea that it is, and it opens her eyes, I think she'll get it. One, she'll get it like this, and two, she'll completely reverse her position. She'll find a way to spin it, but it's okay. She'll now it's green, but that's fine. I think if she actually looks at this, she'll say, "Oh my God, where was this for my whole career? Because I needed this to actually accomplish some of the, progressive and in this case the equitable goals of banking on banks that she wanted to fight for all along." And it's just about educating politicians. And again, this is an inevitable thing for the U.S. to go in and hold reserves. I think for different states to go in and hold reserves. I love that you're floating this idea. You want to pitch this. It just has to happen for any kind of jurisdiction to have long-term, to be a long-term capital powerhouse. Let's put it that way, right? And again, you're right. China does not make a lot of mistakes, and this is an epic blunder. And this is one of those things where you're I don't know, somebody fumbles in their own on their own 1 yard line. All we got to do is pick up the ball and just score that touchdown right in the last minute of the fourth quarter. That's literally all we have to do, and it's right there for our taking. And people are moving. Are you seeing miners moving to Texas? Are you seeing more activity?
Oh yeah, we're getting emails all the time from miners that are wanting to move to Texas. They're saying, "Hey, can you introduce me to somebody who's got hosting space for 50,000 miners, or for is there real estate that we can snap up?" And we're happy to work with them, although in Texas we will want these companies to be Western owned companies. The critical infrastructure in Texas cannot be owned by Chinese, Iranian, or North Korean companies. So they're going to have to play within the rules, right? They're going to have to take on majority ownership by Western OECD countries to operate here. But we're not against them operating here. We're welcoming of it. We're really not for companies that are fully owned, state-owned, especially state-owned companies, Chinese state-owned companies that the Chinese Communist Party may or may not control, operating critical infrastructure in Texas. But again, not to say that we're very supportive of them coming. It's just they have to do it within the right the framework.
Sure. Fantastic. So what was the website one more time?
Yeah, it's texasblockchainsummit.org.
Perfect. TexasBlockchainSummit.org. We need to have you back on because I have a lot of questions, a lot of things to talk about. But thank you so much for coming. Folks, I'm a big fan of what Lee's doing. I'm a big fan of the council. We haven't even touched upon the states and the wonderful work, the packages you put together for lawmakers. And I know I've connected you to some, and I look forward to helping you. So, thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this, for your time. And I'll only let you go if you promise to come back on.
Oh yeah, yeah, we'll be back on because we got a lot more to talk about. Like you said, the state associations are starting to organize, and that's a really powerful force when you get, there's probably 40 different states that have blockchain associations, and when you get those groups organized, you can have some influence on the federal level.
Amazing. I love it. Well, thank you, Lee. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex.